That actually leads me to one of our questions. This one comes from Roxana, and she asked, her email's titled, or question's titled, to list prices or not to list prices. So she says, hello, I was just discussing over this with my artist friends, and we couldn't get to any conclusion. So I was very curious what your opinion on this would be. Should you show your prices on your website or not? How can an artist decide if it's best to show the price per character, background, extra details, etc.? Or on the other hand, is it best to have the client contact you and give them a price depending on the details of the piece? Thank you very much. So they're specifically talking about possibly freelance work, but I think it's also interesting that you had a painting for sale with no price listed next to it. And I know
no, my price was listed, but my gallery was closed, so he couldn't see it.
Oh, okay. So they couldn't see it. Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes at cons, I will see, and I've done this myself too, I will see prices not listed. There's a bunch of things for sale, but there's no prices listed. So my question to you guys is, we'll take these one at a time. On when you're selling stuff at a gallery or at a convention, what's your take on listing prices or not?
Always list.
I have a huge pet peeve of people not listing the price.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, it seems, are you going to change it for each person? I mean, I just have such a skepticism about that. Just show the price. I mean, we're all there. They're there to sell the thing. That's why they're at the gallery. Otherwise, it'd be in a museum and not for sale at all.
Yeah, and you gotta price it to sell. I mean, that's the thing. I would always try to come up with a really good value proposition at the conventions that I would do, and I stood behind my prices. I felt like they were priced really well, and the success prove that, and if you're now, I would not, well, you're taking these one at a time, so I'll just leave it at that.
I have a counter argument for the convention thing. So I have a friend, very successful with his con business. You know him, Will. And
which is this, the young kid?
No.
Oh.
No. A Utah artist.
Oh, okay.
Anyways.
No.
And he wouldn't list prices. I don't know if he does now, but early on he wouldn't list prices. And his reasoning was, I want them to make a connection with the piece outside of value, like outside of the money thing. Because he's like, I don't want people to just turn off and say like, oh, be turned off because it's out of their price range. And instead he wants them to really be thinking, oh, this is something I got to have. And when they get to that stage where they ask how much for this, they are more likely to buy it than the person who wanders off, right? And so that was an argument for that. And I worked with that, but and I tried that for a little while, but I think the difference was the things he was selling were a little bit more premium, I would say, a little bit more upscale, and for what you would normally get at a con. And what I was doing was a little bit more schlocky, I would say. I mean, just art books, right? It's a book and some prints and things like that. But my biggest sellers at cons were books, art books. So ultimately, I just started listing my prices. So that's one argument I would say for not listing a price in that situation.
Buy it. I think in general, I think people, myself, if I didn't see prices, I'd probably think, well, it's too much. That's why they're not listing it.
There's never been a time where a price isn't listed and then you find out the price and you're like, oh, that's reasonable.
Right. That's a good point.
Never happens.
Yeah.
So this is just me
the
trying
guy
to.
that you're talking about. He's our friend, right?
Yeah.
Well, he lists them now, so obviously it didn't work.
Yeah, maybe so. I'm just sometimes we disagree, so I just wanted to throw that out there.
You tried to manufacture a controversy there.
That's
Calling
fake
me
controversy.
Calling me out. Okay. So what about on your website? Let's say, hey, hire me, I'm a character designer, or hire me, I'm
Oh God, that's a great point to bring up during this. I do never list your prices for a service-based thing.
Yeah. Yeah, because the parameters on every job are so different, and
the rights are
someone
different. It's
asking
everything.
you to illustrate, 10 different spots of, objects is so much easier than 10 figures, 10 children or 10 adults doing different things in various poses. And so there's no way that I wouldn't even want to charge the same per hour.
I wouldn't even charge per hour. I mean, we've
Yeah,
already
I
gone
don't
down that
charge
road
per
before,
hour either.
but
Have we talked about that on the podcast?
Well, now you're manufacturing.
We have. We've talked about that on the podcast, but it's I see it all the time from beginner illustrators. They'll say, I'll do I see sometimes either fan art or a portrait, and it'll say a black and white portrait, $60, and in color it's $80. And you're just advertising yourself as an amateur right there. That is A, that's super underpriced. And then B, it's just like Will said, there's so many variables to what you're providing. The scale you're providing, is it an original or a digital file? I mean, all kinds of stuff. Don't list your prices.
Unless, and there's a caveat there, unless it's commission work. So let's typically people will be like, hey, commissions are open. I'll draw your D&D character, your fantasy character. I'll design them and draw them. It'll be $100 black and white, $200 color, and $300.
Okay. So that's the example I was just given. So you're saying if it's what would you do the same thing if it was in a portrait? I mean, that's sort of what I just said. You would say, yeah, okay, list it for a portrait.
Yeah, I would. Like if you're doing pet portraits or something like that, and you want to essentially open it, be available for a week's time, and however many people you sign up in that week's time, you're going to have, I think, a much better chance filling up all your slots if your prices are just listed, because it's more of a product than a service is what you're doing.
Can I add a recommendation there if you're going to do that? Yeah. Put a range of prices next to each one instead of what the actual price is, because like Will was saying, there's such a variety, and even some characters are simple and some characters are complicated. Some are easy, some are going to be more difficult. So black and white D&D character, maybe the range is $50 to $200, depending on complexity. And if you just write that out, any normal person would say, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's fair. But as far as freelance work, you're not usually listing, here's my day rate. What typically happens is someone wants to hire you for any sort of job, illustrating a picture book or doing character designs for a TV show or something like that. They're going to reach out. They're going to email you and say, hey, we want to know if you have availability for this project. It's from this time to this time. You tell them yes. Then they'll say, great, what is your rate? And what they're usually wanting to know is how much do you charge a day? And so what I've done in the past too is, and what I currently do is, well, here's my day rate, but we can figure out just a price for the whole job, the overall job. And I can give you an estimate so we don't have to keep track of days and things like that. And usually that works out better for both parties because they feel comfortable asking for revisions, and I've usually padded it a little bit knowing there'll be revisions, and they know they can easily budget. We have this much for this artist to create this, and that works good for their books, and they're not going to be have sticker shock when they get the invoice. And so that's one way, I think, one way to do it. The reason you don't want to charge hourly is it's a little, I think it does lean amateur, right, Lee? It means you aren't confident enough in how much time it takes for you to do a certain thing. It's sort of a little bit like I think your client feels a little nickeled and dimed too. I spent 30 minutes on this, so I'm going to charge you, 150 for that little thing that I did.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't hire someone and when if you take your car in, they have a shop rate, they have an hourly rate, and you say, they say, well, it's going to be parts plus labor, and you're like, and they'll always give you an estimate on what they think. It's probably, we're going to bill it at, an hour and a half but it usually takes us an hour. So it'll probably be done in an hour, and we might only bill you for the hour, but be prepared because it could be an hour and a half. So, you kind of get an idea, but I doubt that artists would ever do that. So if I was a client, I'd be sitting there going, well, are they going to bill me for 10 hours, 20 hours, 30 hours? Are they really working during that time? All of a sudden it just gets into all kinds of, I just want to know how much. I need to know. I have a budget. I need to know how much it's going to cost to get this thing. If it's too much, I just won't do it.
Right.
If it's close, we'll negotiate.
Right. And you could put on your website too, you could say, here's the amount of work I get done in a day. So you hire me for a day, I can do, five sketches, or I can do one detailed landscape drawing. For a week's time, I can do a full color, hero image, just so that they can also get an idea of what they're signing up for, because that's the other variable. It's like, okay, your day rate's, $450. Well, what am I getting for a day of work? So you might want to do that on there as well.
It's tough. These are weird issues. I mean, it's a really weird.
Yeah. And don't be, if someone's reaching out because they want to work with you, don't be afraid of negotiating. Don't be afraid of standing firm on what your prices are. And don't be afraid to also work with them, work with them on their price, and just say, what's your budget? Well, my budget's $600. And you could say, well, here's what I can give you for $600. And then they get a better idea. Yeah. Then they can get a better idea of what the market rate is for work and what you're comfortable doing for that amount. I like to do that with commissions too. Like I'll, at a convention, whenever these happen again, I plan on doing this. I'll just say, I'm doing black and white drawings for, $200, right? With some marker, some marker color add to them or something like that. I'll just list it at $200. And someone will come up to me and be like, $200? All I have is, my budget's like $50 for something. And I said, all right, $50. I can do half the size, and I won't add marker. And they'll be happy to have
they want
a
original
small
jig.
drawing. Yeah. They'll happy to have a small drawing.
I'll tell you what, though, I mean, I've seen David Hone use that same technique and go bring clients from low to high instead of from high to low, because they ask for something, and David, and at first they just ask, how much does this thing cost? And David will say it's expensive, because they're typically asking for typically a rush job, full color, giant thing, all these rights, and David comes back with the full price, and they're like, oh man, that's way out of our budget. And then David's like, well, I can do it. Same thing you're saying. I can, I'll limit your rights. I'll shrink the illustration. We'll do half the size, half the scope, and I can do it for that. Exactly like you say. And then most of the time they're like, no, we really want the big. We got to do the big one. It's got to
be done right.
And so he's like, all right. So he just went from 500 to 2,000 or whatever. You know what I mean? And
That's brilliant.
And he's fine with everything in between. And the client doesn't feel gypped, because, like you said, you're working with them and they understand where that value is.
Justified your price. Yeah. I guarantee anyone listening, the more work you do, the more expert you will become at bidding and pricing your work. Because you'll screw it up, and when you screw it up, it's painful, because you end up working for so much less money, and you just learn. You won't let that happen to you too much.
Right.
Do you know there's something I've noticed between experienced illustrators and beginners with this, that when asked how much something cost, the beginner illustrator will basically work either right around or even go a little bit lower than they think the minimum amount is that they need. You know what I mean? Like, I need $100. That seems like a lot. I'll tell them it's 90. They'll back off of that number. Whereas the pro will say, oh man, this is worth 1,000. So I'm going to quote them 3 and start at that number. You know what I mean? And and it's a really good lesson, because the amateur's looking to make the minimum. The pro is looking to make the maximum. And
Right,
and most of the
right.
time, people have the budget is higher than you think it's going to be. Don't assume what the other person is willing to pay, and don't assume what. And here's how it works out, though. Typically, is you get into the job, and this always happens, even as a pro. Almost every job has some weird level of difficulty that we didn't factor in. And so by taking a minimum job of 1,500, and if I add $1,000 to it, so now that job is 2,500. The client agrees to it. I get into it. And then there's some problem that I run into that it turns it into actually a $2,500 job. You know what I mean? And rarely does it go as smoothly as you thought it would, as quickly as you thought it would, and you're just better served that way. So watch out for just shooting at the minimum you need, pad it in there because something's always going to go wrong. And again, don't assume what your client is willing to pay.